Imagine being 12 years old. You are dressed completely in white, your hair carefully arranged, then divided with the sharp tip of a spear. Outside, you hear a crowd gathering, hundreds of strangers waiting to witness what is about to happen. Your mother is crying, though you do not yet understand why. A man you barely remember meeting once a month ago is walking toward you, and everyone around you is smiling as if this is perfectly normal. In a few hours, you will understand your mother's tears. Soon you will be carried through the streets while strangers shout crude jokes and insults at you. And when you finally reach a house you have never seen before, the worst part of the night will begin in the most public room of that home, where everyone can hear what happens next. This is not fiction or exaggeration. This was a Roman wedding night. And what I am about to describe is so unsettling that even Rome seemed to quietly erase it from memory. The rituals were recorded by Roman writers, criticized by early Christians, and then gradually forgotten, as if an entire civilization decided some traditions were simply too shameful to preserve. By the end, you will understand why modern historians sometimes call it state-sanctioned trauma. You will hear about the strange god whose shrine demanded one last act of submission. And you will never look at ancient Rome in quite the same way again. But be warned, it becomes darker than you probably expect. Start with a fact that should stop you cold. Under Roman law, a girl could legally marry at 12 years old. Not 16, not 14, 12, the age when many children today are still in middle school. And this was not rare or exceptional. Archaeological evidence from burial sites shows that many girls married and became mothers between 12 and 15. Studies of epitaphs suggest elite women often married around 14, and poorer girls even earlier. While we praise Rome for its roads, aqueducts, philosophy, and legal systems, we are also looking at a society that routinely handed children over to adult men as wives. The grooms were usually in their late 20s or 30s, sometimes older. The gap in age was not accidental. It was intentional, built into the system to guarantee an imbalance of power. Roman legal scholars loved to speak about consent. They wrote detailed arguments claiming both bride and groom had to agree. On paper it sounds surprisingly modern. But what did consent actually mean in practice? Picture yourself at 13. Your father is the pater familias, the unquestioned head of the household. Roman law gives him near total authority over you. He controls your property, your status, and your future. In earlier times he even held the legal right to punish or kill his children for disobedience. Now that man tells you that you will marry a 30-year-old stranger because the match benefits the family's politics, finances, or alliances. Maybe you met him once in a formal visit. Can you truly refuse? Could any child refuse? This was Roman consent. Technically required, but trapped inside a system so coercive that the word itself becomes hollow. The earliest type of marriage was called cum manu, meaning under the hand, literally under control. The legal language is unsettling because it mirrors the vocabulary of property transfer. The bride passed from her father's authority to her husband's, like an object changing owners. She was not legally a slave, but the language of ownership surrounded her life. Any inheritance became her husband's. Any money she possessed became his. Gifts belonged to him. Legally, she was absorbed into his household as though her birth family no longer mattered. Later periods introduced forms of marriage that allowed women a bit more independence, but those earlier customs cast a long shadow, and many of the rituals survived long after the laws softened. On the day before the wedding, the girl underwent a symbolic transformation meant to mark her passage from childhood to wifehood. When you look closely at the symbolism, it is deeply disturbing. Her hair was parted not with a comb or ornament, but with the point of a spear. And not just any spear. Tradition claimed it had been used to kill a gladiator, a weapon associated with blood, violence, and conquest. Even the preparation for marriage carried the message that this union was not about romance or choice. It was about control, domination, and the quiet surrender of a child to a system far older and far stronger than she was. Let that sink in for a moment. A weapon meant for killing, still symbolically stained with death, was used to prepare a child for marriage. Why would a culture choose something so violent for such an intimate ritual? Ancient writers claimed it brought luck, fertility, or protection from evil spirits. But the symbolism is impossible to ignore. Marriage, like warfare, was framed as conquest, as surrender, as one side yielding power to another. Her hair was then divided into 6 tight braids, arranged in a style known as the sex crines, traditionally worn by the Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to purity. She dressed in a simple white tunic called the tunica recta, woven in an archaic manner to connect her to Rome's distant past. Every detail of her appearance marked her as liminal, suspended between two lives, no longer a girl yet not fully a wife, standing awkwardly between her father's household and her husband's, between the identity she knew and the one being forced upon her. Around her waist they tied the knot of Hercules, a complicated binding that only her husband was allowed to untie. The message was painfully explicit. Her body was fastened closed, and he alone possessed the right to unlock it. Even before the ceremony truly began, control over her body had already been symbolically transferred. When evening fell, the most public and unsettling part of the wedding commenced, the deductio in domum, the formal procession escorting the bride to the groom's house. And this is where Roman marriage stops feeling ceremonial and begins to resemble a staged reenactment of violence. The entire procession deliberately echoed one of Rome's founding legends, the rape of the Sabine women. According to the myth, early Rome lacked wives, so Romulus invited neighboring communities to a festival and then ordered his men to seize the women by force and carry them away. Instead of treating this story as shameful, the Romans celebrated it. They carved it into monuments and painted it on walls. Even more disturbingly, they recreated its elements during elite weddings. Ancient descriptions make the procession sound less like a celebration and more like an abduction. The groom would seize the bride, sometimes literally pulling her from her mother's embrace in a mock struggle. The girl was expected to display what they called pudor, a mixture of modesty, shame, and reluctance. She was supposed to resist, to cry, to appear frightened. That behavior was praised as virtuous. Now imagine being 13 and told this is how a good bride behaves. You rehearse the fear because you're told to. You cling to your mother because tradition demands it. You pretend to hesitate at the doorway. But here's the question that lingers uncomfortably. When does pretend fear become real fear? When does ritualized terror stop being theater and start being trauma? For many girls, there must have been no difference at all. They were children handed over to older strangers during a public ceremony explicitly designed to dramatize their loss of control. The performance and the reality blended together. As the procession moved through the streets of Rome, it drew crowds who didn't simply observe. They participated loudly and enthusiastically. People sang what were known as Fescennine verses, songs famous for being obscene, vulgar, and deliberately crude. These weren't tender wishes for happiness. They were graphic sexual jokes and mocking predictions about the wedding night. Roman writers insisted this vulgarity served a magical purpose, that indecent humor scared away jealous spirits who might curse the couple's good fortune. But consider the experience from the bride's point of view. You're paraded through dark streets, surrounded by strangers shouting explicit comments about what will soon happen to you, reducing your future to a public spectacle. You're barely a teenager. This wasn't simply celebration. It was a psychological ordeal, a deliberate breaking down of your old self, so a new, obedient role could take its place. Every element, the staged kidnapping, the expected tears, the obscene chanting, reinforced the same lesson. Your wishes didn't matter. Your autonomy didn't matter. Your identity now belonged to someone else. The procession took place at night, illuminated by torches. This wasn't practical necessity, but symbolism. The flames echoed the Sabine legend again, recalling the nighttime festival when those women were first seized. The flickering light distorted faces, stretching shadows across the streets, turning the crowd into something almost threatening and unreal. Fire, noise, and jeering voices surrounded the girl from every side, overwhelming her senses and marking the moment as a permanent rupture, a point of no return. One Roman poet described the night as a time when shame fled and modesty was conquered, a moment when resistance was expected to collapse. And beneath all the ritual language about tradition and fortune, what remained was simple and chilling. A child being guided step by step away from everything familiar toward a future she never truly chose. The language itself is revealing. The purpose of these rituals was never truly to celebrate the bride's joy or welcome her into a loving partnership. It was to dismantle her modesty, to erode her resistance, to deliberately wear down her shame so that what followed would feel inevitable rather than shocking. Everything pointed towards psychological conditioning. By the time the procession finally reached the groom's house, another custom awaited, one that sounds gentle on the surface but carries a deeper implication once you look closely. The bride was forbidden from stepping over the threshold on her own. To trip or stumble was considered a disastrous omen, a sign of future misfortune, so she had to be lifted and carried inside by attendants or slaves. Ancient writers explain this as simple superstition, a way to avoid bad luck or appease the household spirits. And maybe that explanation satisfied them. But symbolically, the message is impossible to miss. She did not walk into her new life under her own power. She did not cross that boundary herself. She was transported passive, handled like an object being moved from one place to another. From the very first moment inside, the house was not hers through choice or agency. She was there because others had placed her there. Once inside, she stood in the atrium, the vast open center of the Roman home, surrounded by columns, family portraits, and the shrine of the ancestors. This was not a private corner, but the most public and symbolic space in the entire household, where guests were received and business was conducted. And there, in front of witnesses and expectations, she performed one of the most famous acts of Roman marriage. She recited the traditional phrase, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, usually translated as where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The names themselves didn't matter. They were placeholders, like saying John and Jane. What mattered was the meaning. It wasn't a promise of partnership or mutual support. It was something far more absolute. Wherever you exist, I exist. Your position defines mine. Your life consumes mine. It implied not union but absorption, the erasure of individuality. Some historians argue that not every bride spoke these exact words, that it may have been more symbolic than universal. But the fact that Roman culture held it up as the ideal tells us everything. This was what marriage was supposed to represent, not two people joining, but one dissolving into the other. Her separate identity effectively died at that moment, replaced by a new role defined entirely through her husband. And then we need to consider where all of this took place. The atrium was the social heart of the house. Clients, visitors, and business associates walked through it daily. Ancestor masks and family relics stared down from the walls, silent reminders of lineage and duty. It was where the family displayed its dignity and honor. And astonishingly, it was also where the wedding bed, the lectus genialis, was placed. Not hidden away in a bedroom, not tucked into privacy, but positioned right there in open view. The bed itself was lavish, draped with fine cloth and decorations, presented almost like a sacred object. It symbolized fertility, continuity, the production of heirs. But in practice, this meant that the most intimate moment of the bride's life would occur in the most exposed setting possible. Privacy, in the modern sense, simply didn't exist. Her first night wasn't meant to be personal. It was communal, symbolic, almost performative, a matter of family importance rather than individual feeling. Before we get to what happened next, it's worth clearing up one persistent misconception. Popular imagination often claims that Roman consummation was literally public, that crowds stood around watching. That's likely an exaggeration. There's no solid evidence for an audience staring directly at the couple. But the truth is unsettling enough without turning it into spectacle. Even if no one watched, people were always nearby. The bed was in the atrium. Doors, if present at all, were rarely sealed. Servants lingered. The pranuba, the matron assigned to guide the bride, often waited just outside. Voices, footsteps, and movement filled the house. The bride knew she wasn't alone. She knew that others could hear everything. The sense of exposure would have been constant. Imagine being barely a teenager, surrounded by strangers, in an unfamiliar house, expected to perform a role you barely understand while the household listens just beyond a thin barrier. That knowledge alone would be suffocating. And then there was the knot of Hercules tied tightly around her waist earlier that day, a complicated binding only her husband was permitted to undo. Even the final act of undressing wasn't hers to control. The symbolism came full circle. She had been bound, transferred, carried, renamed, positioned, and displayed. Every step of the ritual reinforced the same idea. Your body is no longer your own. By the time the night truly began, the ceremony had already accomplished its purpose. Whatever resistance or identity she once possessed had been carefully, methodically stripped away, leaving a girl who had been prepared not for celebration, but for surrender. The special knot tied around the bride's waist was more than decoration. It was a marker, a signal that her body was sealed, reserved, not yet claimed. Throughout the ceremony, it had functioned like a lock, a visible reminder that she belonged to no one until the final moment. And this was when it was undone. Only the husband was allowed to untie it. Ancient writers tried to soften the scene, dressing it up as something tender, almost playful. They described it as a test of skill, a small challenge of patience and dexterity. Some even claimed that if the husband struggled with the knot, it meant the marriage might face hardship, while a smooth untying promised fertility and good fortune. It sounds harmless when framed that way, almost sweet. But strip away the poetic language, and you're left with a much harsher reality. A grown man was undressing a child. Because that's what many of these brides were. 12, 13, 14 at most. Girls barely past childhood, standing in a strange house, surrounded by unfamiliar people, about to be handed over in a ritual everyone present understood was the prelude to consummation. The knot itself was named after Hercules, the ultimate symbol of strength and conquest in Roman mythology, a hero known not for gentleness, but for overpowering his enemies through brute force. That choice of symbol wasn't accidental. It wasn't about tenderness or romance. It was about domination. It sent a clear message about what this moment represented. And it's important not to let the historical distance numb us to what that actually means. We're talking about adult men in their late 20s, 30s, sometimes even older, being granted full legal rights over the bodies of girls who had no real say in the matter. Girls whose fathers had arranged these marriages for alliances, property, or social advancement. Girls who might have met their future husbands once or twice at most. Modern historians don't sugarcoat this anymore. They use terms like coercion and institutional abuse, because that's the most accurate language we have. Roman law insisted it was consensual. Roman culture wrapped it in tradition and religion and respectability. But none of that changes the fundamental truth. These were children being transferred to adult men for sex, and the entire structure of society existed to make it appear normal and necessary. Even the supposedly comforting figures around the bride served that system. The pranuba, usually a married woman and often a relative, was assigned to guide her through the night. On paper, she was there for reassurance, someone experienced who could calm nerves and offer advice. But think about what that role really meant. She wasn't there to protect the girl's autonomy. She was there to ensure the marriage was completed, to soothe her if she cried, to persuade her if she hesitated, to make sure nothing interfered with what everyone else expected to happen. Some sources say the pranuba waited just outside, not watching but close enough to step in if necessary. And you have to ask yourself, intervene how? What situations were they anticipating? The silence of the sources is almost louder than any description. Her job wasn't comfort. It was compliance. And then we reach the most controversial part of the story, the piece that even many historians hesitate to touch because the evidence is so messy. Almost everything we know about it comes from later Christian writers like Augustine, men who had every incentive to portray older pagan practices as depraved and disgusting. They weren't neutral observers. They were polemicists with an agenda. Yet they describe a fertility cult centered on a minor god called Mutinous Tutunus, whose shrine allegedly housed a sacred effigy shaped like an oversized phallus. According to these hostile accounts, before the wedding night truly began, the bride was led to this shrine and made to sit on the statue as a ritual act meant to ensure fertility. It was framed as a blessing, a sacred rite connecting her to divine power. But if taken at face value, it reads like something else entirely, an institutionalized violation wrapped in religious language. The problem is that no contemporary pagan Roman writer ever confirms this. Not one. Which means it could be exaggerated, misunderstood, or entirely invented as propaganda meant to shock Christian audiences. It might have been a localized custom blown out of proportion, or it might never have happened at all. We genuinely can't be certain. But here's why it still matters. Even if the story was fabricated, even if it was slander, the fact that people found it believable says something important about how harsh and coercive Roman marriage already was. The baseline reality was already disturbing enough that such an accusation didn't feel impossible. And that alone tells you how dark these traditions could be. It tells us something deeply uncomfortable about Rome that often gets brushed aside. It tells us that Roman wedding customs were already disturbing enough that an accusation like this felt believable. That people could hear a story about a bride being forced into some humiliating fertility rite and simply shrug and think, yeah, that sounds about right for how Rome treats its women. That's the key point. Whether or not the Mutinous Tutunus ritual actually happened exactly as described almost becomes secondary. The fact that it fits so easily into the broader picture is what matters. Because we know for certain that Roman weddings were already filled with acts designed to strip away a girl's autonomy piece by piece. The mock kidnapping, the forced display of fear, the obscene songs shouted by crowds, the bed placed in the most public room of the house, the attendants lingering close enough to hear everything. None of this was about romance. None of it was about partnership. The entire structure of the ceremony pointed in one direction only: submission. Submission to the husband, submission to the family, submission to the expectations of society. And when you look at Roman religious life more broadly, it becomes even harder to dismiss these darker elements as exaggerations. Roman fertility rituals were often shockingly physical and openly sexual in symbolism. We know about the cult of bona dea, where rites excluded men entirely, but were filled with strange bodily symbolism. We know about the Lupercalia festival, where half-naked men ran through the streets striking women with strips of goat hide because it was believed to promote fertility and safe childbirth. We know about the fascinum, the little phallic charms displayed on doorways, necklaces, even children's clothing to ward off evil and encourage prosperity. Rome did not separate religion from sexuality the way modern cultures often try to. Fertility, power, sex, and sacred ritual were all tangled together. So when Christian writers describe something extreme, something uncomfortable, we have to be skeptical, yes, but we also can't pretend it's completely impossible. It fits the broader pattern too well. And here's a question that should really bother us. If these rituals were so normal, so central to daily life, why don't Roman writers talk about them more openly? We have thousands upon thousands of pages from Roman historians. Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny. Men who documented everything. Wars, elections, betrayals, dinner parties, scandals, even gossip about emperors' private habits. Yet when it comes to the intimate details of wedding nights, suddenly there's silence. Vague language. Euphemisms. A quick fade to black. The standard explanation is simple. These were domestic matters, women's matters, and elite male historians just didn't care. Their focus was the public world of politics and battlefields. And sure, that's partly true. But some modern historians suspect something else was happening too. As Rome grew richer and more cosmopolitan, as it absorbed Greek philosophy and started thinking of itself as the height of civilization, some of these old traditions began to look crude, even embarrassing. The Romans loved to see themselves as rational, refined, lawful, superior to the barbarian world around them. But how civilized could you really claim to be while still reenacting ritual abductions and marrying children to men twice their age? How enlightened could you pretend to be when your wedding ceremonies looked less like celebrations and more like psychological conditioning? So instead of proudly describing these customs, writers simply stopped mentioning them. They kept the rituals because tradition was sacred and ancestors had done the same, but they avoided discussing the details. It was easier to let silence do the work. Then Christianity arrived, and the rewriting accelerated. Early Christians were deeply uncomfortable with pagan sexuality, and especially hostile toward anything that looked coercive or public. So they attacked these rituals aggressively, sometimes exaggerating them to make pagan Rome look morally bankrupt. At the same time, they replaced them with new marriage models that emphasized modesty, privacy, and spiritual union rather than spectacle and domination. Slowly, the old practices faded. The meanings blurred. Within a few centuries, people barely remembered what Roman weddings had really looked like. By the medieval period, when Europe started romanticizing Rome as its cultural ancestor, there was a strong incentive to remember only the impressive parts. The roads, the laws, the architecture, the military genius. No one wanted to dwell on the darker traditions. No one wanted to talk about 12-year-old brides being paraded through streets while crowds shouted obscenities. But here's why all of this still matters. Because we're constantly told to admire Rome. We're told it's the foundation of Western civilization, the cradle of law and order and rational government. And if we're going to claim Rome as our heritage, we have to be honest about what that heritage includes. Not just aqueducts and philosophy, but also systematic control over women's bodies. Not just legal codes, but rituals that normalized fear and compliance. History isn't a highlight reel. It's a full picture. And Rome's wedding customs show us exactly how power operates at its most intimate level. Not always through armies or decrees, but through tradition, through family expectations, through ceremonies that make domination feel natural and inevitable. So the next time you see a polished marble statue or a romantic painting of ancient Rome, Remember what was happening behind those walls. Remember the children dressed for marriage with spear points. Remember the crowds laughing and jeering. Remember the bed waiting in the atrium where privacy didn't exist. Power doesn't only live in senates and battlefields. Sometimes it shows itself most clearly in the quiet, personal spaces where people are told they have no choice. The Romans tried to forget this. Later generations tried to soften it. But the evidence is still there if you're willing to look closely. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.